In Japan, every school year ends with a touching ritual. Children gently sort through their notebooks, thank each one for its service, and let them go. It's not just tidying up, it's closure, gratitude, and peace in motion. Now imagine if we, as seniors, approached our own piles of paper, the decades of bills, letters, recipes, and keepsakes, with the same reverence. Each sheet holds a whisper of a life lived, a mortgage statement that once marked a first home, a faded birthday card from a parent long gone, a handwritten recipe that fed generations. We don't cling to clutter because we're careless, we hold on because it holds us. But somewhere within those stacks lies a quiet invitation, to let go gently, not to forget, but to make room for calm. Today, I want to show you how this simple Japanese ritual can transform how you see your papers and your memories. Because decluttering, at its heart, isn't about getting rid of the past. It's about organizing gratitude, one folder at a time. Before we dive in, take a deep breath, subscribe, and join this growing circle of wise hearts learning to live lighter. Because simplicity isn't just an aesthetic, it's freedom, peace, and self-respect. And that's exactly what Noriko Hayama, 68, discovered when she decided to bring this ritual into her own life. Her story might just inspire you to pick up your first folder and begin again. Meet Noriko Hayama, 68, a retired art teacher living in Portland, Oregon. Her life, once painted in the vibrant colors of classrooms and children's laughter, has grown quieter since retirement. Yet in that stillness, her dining table has become a monument to memory, covered in towers of paper. Lesson plans from the 90s, her husband Kenji's medical notes, postcards from students who became artists, and hand-drawn cards from her grandchildren, every sheet carries a heartbeat. To the casual eye, it's clutter. But to Noriko, it's sacred evidence that she has lived, loved, and mattered. She isn't untidy, she's sentimental. These papers are the threads that keep her connected to people, moments, and emotions that time could never fully erase. After Kenji's passing 2 years ago, the silence of their house grew thick. Her 2 grown children, both living across states, called often but visited rarely. So Noriko's papers became her company. On most afternoons, she'd sit with her tea, ready to organize, but a faded letter or sketch would pull her into another decade. The task would stop, her eyes would mist, and she'd let the day drift by. It wasn't disorganization, it was devotion. These papers weren't reminders of a mess, they were reminders of meaning. Then, one night, while watching a short documentary about Japanese school children, something clicked. The children carefully sorted their notebooks, whispering thank you before discarding them. That small act of gratitude hit Noriko like a whisper from the universe. Maybe the problem wasn't that she couldn't let go, maybe she never learned how to say goodbye with grace. That night, she made a quiet promise. She would create 7 folders, not to declutter, but to honor her life's paper trail. Each folder would hold a chapter of gratitude. She wasn't organizing a table, she was organizing her heart. The next morning, she picked up her first folder, and with it, began a journey that would bring peace where paper once lived. Folder 1. Today's papers, the breath of the present. Noriko's first folder sat before her, plain and unassuming, labeled carefully in her soft, practiced handwriting, Today's Papers. It was more than a title, it was a declaration. 4 years, her papers had been a tangle of decades, tax records beside birthday cards, warranties beside recipes. Each page had shouted for attention, and together they formed a chorus of unfinished business. But this folder represented something different. It wasn't about tidying, it was about choosing the now. She began the ritual by asking herself a question she had never considered before: what truly belongs to this moment? On her table lay a small mountain of life's residue, unpaid bills, appointment slips, charity letters, grocery lists. These were the living papers of the present. She carefully placed each one into the folder, pausing to breathe between decisions. The movement was simple but profound. Each page she filed felt like a breath drawn deeper, a quiet exhale of order returning to her days. Then came the harder part, the papers that didn't belong. The just-in-case pile. Noriko found herself staring at a stack of expired coupons, bank notices from 10 years ago, and warranties for appliances she no longer owned. They whispered the same familiar words she'd heard for years. Keep me, you might need me someday. But she understood now, that whisper was fear, not wisdom. The fear of forgetting, of losing control, of not being prepared. She sat with that thought. For most of her life, she had saved just-in-case papers as proof of her responsibility. But all they had done was crowd her peace. As she began to let them go, something unexpected happened. Instead of anxiety, she felt relief, like finally exhaling after holding her breath too long. Each paper released was a small reclaiming of trust. Trust in herself, trust in the present, trust that she would handle tomorrow when it came. She smiled as she picked up an old envelope labeled Urgent, 2004. Inside, a power bill from a home she no longer lived in. She laughed quietly at the word urgent. What had once seemed so pressing had faded into irrelevance. She whispered, "Thank you for your service," before feeding it gently into the shredder. It wasn't waste, it was release. By the afternoon, the folder looked surprisingly thin. Inside were only a few essentials: a recent medical bill, a reminder for her next checkup, and a note about the community art fair she planned to attend. Everything else, the noise of the past, had been sorted, shredded, or recycled. But the real transformation wasn't on the table. It was inside her. That evening, as Noriko prepared her tea, the dining table gleamed for the first time in years. No stacks, no reminders, no guilt. Just the now. She ate slowly, without distraction, feeling her own life return to rhythm. Her home felt different, not emptier, but lighter. The lesson of folder 1 had nothing to do with storage. It was about presence. About realizing how many of our worries come from papers and thoughts that no longer matter. The just-in-case clutter wasn't keeping her safe, it was keeping her stuck. She closed the folder and wrote a small note on the inside cover: "Trust the present. It's enough." Then she placed it neatly on the shelf beside her favorite plant. The rain tapped softly on the window as if applauding her quiet courage. For the first time in years, Noriko didn't feel behind. She felt balanced. Folder 1 wasn't about papers, it was about breathing again. It was the start of a new rhythm, calm, clear, and deeply alive. Folder 2, Family Roots, The Story Keepers. The second folder took longer to label. Noriko stared at the blank tab for several minutes before finally writing Family Roots. It felt heavier than the first, not in weight, but in meaning. She knew this one would take her deep into the heart of her story. All around her were boxes of photographs, family certificates, her parents' immigration papers, and her children's birth announcements. Every document felt sacred, yet suffocating. This was the paper trail of her lineage, proof that her family had lived, loved, and endured. She began by spreading everything out on the floor. The photos first: her mother in Kyoto, smiling beside a bicycle, her father in his old military uniform, her children blowing out birthday candles. Each picture stirred a memory, each paper pulled a thread of emotion. 4 years, she had kept them all mixed together, afraid that sorting them would somehow break the chain that connected her family's story. But as she sat there, Noriko realized that preserving history doesn't mean drowning in it. It means curating it, with care and intention. She started small. Birth certificates in one clear sleeve. Marriage records in another. She placed family photos in labeled envelopes, each representing a generation. For the first time, the past began to make sense in her hands, not as a flood of nostalgia, but as a structured, proud legacy. She wasn't discarding her roots, she was honoring them. Then she came across a folder marked Mom's Letters. Inside were yellowed pages written in her mother's graceful handwriting, mailed decades ago from Japan. The words were full of gentle encouragement, reminders to eat well, to rest, to never forget her art. Noriko felt tears rise as she realized her mother's voice still lived within these papers. But instead of feeling burdened, she felt protected. This was heritage, not clutter. 4 years, she'd been her family's unofficial keeper of everything. Whenever her children or siblings needed an old document, she'd be the one to have it, somewhere. But that role had quietly turned into pressure. The house had become a storage unit for everyone's history. And now, she understood, she didn't have to store her family's past to keep it alive. She only had to organize it into a home of its own. As she filled her family roots folder, she added a handwritten note, "This is where we come from." It would sit in a single, safe spot, one that her children could easily find when they wanted to trace their history. For the first time, her legacy felt lighter, not because it meant less, but because it finally had structure. That night, she called her daughter, Naomi, and told her about the new folder. Naomi laughed softly and said, "Mom, you've just made our family history into something beautiful." Noriko smiled through quiet tears. She had finally become what she was always meant to be, not a keeper of clutter, but a guardian of stories. The lesson of family roots was simple and profound. Heritage deserves a home, not a heap. And by giving her family's story a sacred space, she wasn't letting go of the past. She was ensuring it would always be remembered, neatly, lovingly, and with pride. Got it. I understand exactly what you mean now. Let's correct this properly. You want a fully rewritten and expanded version of the Folder 3, Letting Go, the Farewell Papers section, with a minimum of 3,000 characters and maximum of 3,070 characters. A deep emotional tone that resonates with seniors. No unnecessary overlaps or repeated phrasing from past sections. The writing should maximize engagement, retention, and emotional connection while keeping it fresh and original. Only the text itself, no explanations, no labels, no extra notes. Let's redo it perfectly within that range. Folder 3, Letting Go, the Farewell Papers. Noriko stood by her dining table, the evening light spilling across her papers like quiet waves. This folder, Letting Go, would be the hardest one yet. She had written the name slowly, each letter trembling, because she knew what it meant. It wasn't just about paper. It was about facing the weight of memory, the pieces of life that once held her world together. She began with what was easiest, old receipts curled at the edges, instruction booklets for gadgets she no longer owned, and insurance forms so faded the ink looked like ghosts. As she sorted, she whispered gratitude. "Thank you for serving me." Each word softened the tension in her shoulders. The simple act of acknowledging usefulness made parting feel less like loss and more like completion. But beneath the pile lay a small stack she had avoided for years, Kenji's workshop papers. They carried the scent of cedar and varnish, a whisper of the man who once filled their home with patient laughter. She hadn't opened that folder since his passing. Just looking at it brought a tremor to her hands. Still, she sat down, opened the first envelope, and breathed in deeply. Inside were measurements for a bookshelf he never finished, and small sketches of projects he had planned for their grandchildren. The graphite lines felt alive, like they still carried his warmth. Her eyes blurred, but she didn't cry this time. Instead, she smiled gently. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Keep what matters, let the rest go." So she did. She chose a few pieces to preserve, one sketch, a note with his handwriting, a list where he'd written "paint frame for Noriko" with an arrow drawn beside it. Those went into a slim, transparent sleeve. The rest, she touched with reverence, whispering her thanks before letting them go. Every page she released carried away a little of her fear, her guilt, her hesitation to live freely again. Gratitude became her compass. When the last page slipped into the recycle bin, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was relief. The heaviness she'd mistaken for love dissolved into peace. She realized that holding on too tightly had kept her anchored in sorrow. Letting go wasn't betrayal, it was a final act of faith in the life they'd shared. The Letting Go folder ended up thinner than the others, but it held something far greater, acceptance. It wasn't about discarding the past, but about understanding what should remain in her heart, not her drawers. She felt light, not because the papers were gone, but because her grief had transformed into quiet gratitude. As dusk deepened outside, she placed the folder neatly beside the others. Her hand lingered on the cover, and she whispered softly, "Thank you, Kenji. Thank you for teaching me how to build, and now, how to release." For the first time, the word goodbye didn't sting. It felt sacred, like a prayer carried by the wind. She leaned back and looked around the room. It was the same house, but somehow everything looked clearer, sharper, warmer, freer. The burden she'd carried had turned into space, ready for new memories to find her. In that moment, she realized something powerful. letting go doesn't erase love, it gives it room to breathe. And as the last light faded, Noriko smiled, a smile that said she was ready, finally, to live again. Folder 4, Health and Hope, Caring Made Clear. Noriko titled the next folder Health and Hope, writing the words in gentle blue ink as if to calm her own heartbeat. This folder wasn't just about papers, it was about courage. 4 years, her health documents lived scattered in drawers and envelopes, a quiet chaos that mirrored her unease about aging. She'd avoided sorting them because it felt like confronting her own fragility. But now, she wanted clarity, not fear. She wanted her future to feel less tangled and more understood. She began by gathering every piece: prescriptions, insurance forms, vaccination records, and doctor's notes that stretched back decades. As she arranged them neatly across her table, she realized that each paper told a story, not of decline, but of resilience. Every test, every visit, every note represented care taken, life sustained. There was pride hiding among those pages. She smiled softly at the realization: she wasn't managing illness, she was documenting survival. Noriko divided her folder into clear sections: current medications first, followed by doctor's contact information, recent test results, and her insurance and Medicare papers. For each file she labeled, she felt a growing sense of steadiness. This wasn't just organization, it was empowerment. If something ever happened, her children could find everything they needed. But more importantly, she could find peace knowing that her health story was finally in order. Then came an idea that made her heart swell, a page she titled My Wellness Wish Sheet. On it, she didn't list medical goals but life-centered hopes. Take more morning walks. Join the local art group again. Learn to bake whole grain bread. Try yoga for beginners. These weren't reminders of what to fix, they were declarations of what still mattered. She wasn't waiting to get sick before caring for herself. She was choosing to live well now. As she filled the page, she felt something shift inside her. Growing older no longer felt like a slow retreat, it felt like a wise adjustment. Her body had changed, yes, but her spirit hadn't dimmed, it had ripened. Aging, she realized, wasn't about loss, it was about learning to care differently. When the folder was complete, she slipped it into her cabinet and whispered, "This one keeps me steady." For the first time in years, she knew where every prescription, record, and plan was kept. No panic. No searching. Just readiness and relief. That night, she made a cup of herbal tea and reread her wellness wish sheet. It wasn't perfect, but it was hopeful. The next morning, she hung it on her refrigerator as a quiet promise to herself: stay curious, stay gentle, stay alive. The Health and Hope folder became more than a system, it became a mirror of her strength. Through simple organization, Noriko discovered a truth many overlook: caring for her health papers was another way of caring for herself. Every label, every section, every wish she wrote was an act of love, one that didn't just tidy her life, but steadied her heart. Folder 5, Legacy and Letters, the words that outlive us. The final folder took the longest to name. Noriko sat at her kitchen table, tapping her pen against a blank label, staring at the soft stack of envelopes beside her. Inside them were fragments of a life lived with both gentleness and grit, letters to her late husband, postcards from old friends, and pages of thoughts never shared. Finally, she wrote, Legacy and Letters. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about continuity, what endures when the voice grows faint but the words remain. She opened her old cedar box, the one her mother gave her when she married. Inside were brittle sheets of paper, the kind that carried both ink and time. The first she pulled out was her husband's letter from 1972. The handwriting wobbled but still carried the same warmth. Reading it now, she felt that peculiar ache of love that lingers even after decades of silence. She smiled, folded it neatly, and placed it in a clear plastic sleeve. "You still get to stay," she murmured. Then came her journals. Some were bound in fading leather, others cheap notebooks filled with late-night thoughts and small confessions. At first, she felt tempted to throw them away, those pages knew too much. But as she read, she found beauty in their honesty. They weren't perfect. They were human. She realized her granddaughter might one day learn more about strength and forgiveness from these messy entries than from any advice spoken aloud. So, she began a gentle selection, choosing the pieces that carried essence, not embarrassment. She sorted the writings that revealed courage, moments when she rose after falling, the lessons that came quietly through tears. Each one she slipped into a folder divider marked Keep Forever. She wasn't curating her image, she was preserving her truth. Then she took a new sheet of paper, crisp and unmarked. She wrote the date at the top and began a fresh letter, this one to her granddaughter, Aiko. Her hand moved slowly, her words tender and deliberate. Dear Aiko, if you're reading this someday, I want you to know something simple. I was never fearless, but I always kept moving. The world will rush you, but don't rush yourself. Learn how to pause. Write things down. Even when no one is listening, your heart will understand. When I was your age, I thought wisdom came from knowing things. Now I know it comes from staying open, to joy, to grief, to change. You don't have to be strong all the time. Just be real. Love deeply, even when it scares you. Forgive often, especially yourself. And whenever you find a letter in your hand, mine or anyone's, read it slowly. There's always a heartbeat between the lines. When she finished, tears had dotted the paper, but she didn't wipe them away. They belonged there, part of the ink, part of the memory. She sealed the letter in an envelope and slid it into the folder, right behind her journals. As she closed the folder, a wave of peace washed over her. It wasn't sorrow, it was fulfillment. The folder wasn't heavy with loss, it was alive with love. She realized that not all papers were meant to be thrown away. Some were bridges, between generations, between yesterday and tomorrow. Noriko placed the folder on the shelf, beside the others, and exhaled softly. In her quiet home, surrounded by her carefully kept papers, she felt something profound. She hadn't just organized her life, she had curated her legacy. And when her granddaughter would one day find these words, she wouldn't just discover history, she'd find a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. Folder 6, Dreams Yet to Begin, The Unfolded Pages. When Noriko reached the 6th folder, she hesitated. It was supposed to be the easiest one, just a place for miscellaneous papers. But as she sifted through her old documents, she discovered something unexpected, a handful of dreams she had once postponed and quietly tucked away. There was a brochure for a watercolor retreat in Kyoto, a notebook labeled Garden Ideas, and a half-written list titled Things I'll Do Someday. The ink was faded, but the longing in the words still felt alive. For a moment, she laughed at herself. Someday, she whispered. How many times have I said that? At 67, the idea of starting something new felt both thrilling and absurd. Society often whispers to older hearts that their time for dreaming is over, that life after 60 is meant for reflection, not invention. But as Noriko spread the papers out before her, she realized those whispers were wrong. She picked up the notebook and flipped through it. Sketches of flower arrangements. Notes about places she wanted to visit. Hokkaido's lavender fields, a seaside cafe in Okinawa, a train ride through the autumn forests. Some ideas were incomplete, others impossibly ambitious, but all of them carried a spark she hadn't felt in years. You're not dead ideas, she said softly. You're just waiting. And so, she decided to make the 6th folder a declaration, not a drawer of forgotten plans. Across the front, she wrote in bold letters, Dreams Yet to Begin. It wasn't a folder for the past, it was for the future still unfolding. She began sorting through her papers differently now. The flyers and notes that once made her feel guilty, like reminders of things undone, suddenly became invitations. Each one asked a gentle question, what if there's still time? Noriko made 3 sections inside the folder. The first, Small Steps, held things she could start now, like sketching again or writing a short story. The second, Possible Adventures, was for ideas that needed planning but felt exciting, like visiting a local art class or joining a seniors hiking group. The third, Someday Still Matters, held the big, wild dreams, the ones that might never happen, but gave her something to smile about on quiet evenings. Then she wrote one sentence at the bottom of the folder in blue ink. Hope doesn't retire. As she placed her unfinished projects inside, she noticed something shift within her. It wasn't just about organizing papers anymore, it was about reopening her imagination. She realized that dreams don't expire, they evolve. What she couldn't do at 40 might be possible now, in a gentler, wiser way. Instead of rushing toward outcomes, she found peace in the act of simply beginning again. Later that evening, she made tea and looked out the window as dusk colored the sky. She didn't feel regret anymore. She felt permission to live curiously again, to fail without fear, to explore just for joy's sake. She took one last sheet of paper and wrote, "New project, learn to paint clouds." It wasn't about art. It was about softness, the kind that comes when you stop judging what could have been and start nurturing what could still be. When she slid that page into the folder, she felt lighter. Her room, her mind, even her heart seemed to expand with space she hadn't known she was keeping closed. That night, Noriko didn't dream about her past. She dreamt of a train window, an open field, and the feeling of starting somewhere, anywhere, again. And for the first time in a long while, the pages of her life didn't feel folded and forgotten. They felt open, unwritten, and beautifully ready. Folder 7, Peace of Mind, the quiet space. By the time Noriko reached the final folder, her table was clear, her shelves lighter, and her spirit noticeably calmer. Yet, as she stared at the empty manila folder in front of her, she realized this one was different. Every folder before it had a purpose: to store, to organize, to preserve. But this one was meant for something else entirely. She titled it Peace of Mind. The words looked simple, but they carried a quiet weight. For years, Noriko had filled her days, and her drawers, with tasks, papers, and memories, afraid that stillness might bring loneliness. Silence had once been her most uncomfortable companion. It reminded her of what was gone: her husband's soft footsteps, her children's laughter echoing through the house, the busy rhythm of a life that used to hum with noise and purpose. But decluttering had taught her something surprising: that emptiness, when chosen, isn't loss. It's room. And for the first time in a long while, she wanted to leave a space intentionally unfilled. She placed a single sheet of paper inside the folder, blank except for one handwritten line at the top. "Today, I am grateful for quiet mornings." She didn't need to fill the page. She just let it sit there, a reminder that peace didn't come from doing more, but from allowing herself to simply be. Over the next few weeks, Noriko began using that folder like a gentle journal. Sometimes she wrote a few lines of poetry, reflections from her garden walks, or a note about something that made her smile: a bird nesting on her balcony, the warmth of sunlight through lace curtains. Other times, she opened it and added nothing at all. The act of not filling it became its own form of meditation. Slowly, the folder transformed into something sacred. It wasn't about storing memories or plans, it was about creating emotional space. A soft landing place for her thoughts, her breath, her gratitude. One afternoon, she sat by her window, tea in hand, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. The world outside was still and slow. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to turn on the radio or fill the air with sound. The silence, once heavy, now felt alive, like a quiet song she could finally hear. She added a second paper to the folder that day. On it, she wrote, "Peace doesn't always come after we finish everything. Sometimes, it's what arrives when we stop trying so hard." That night, Noriko placed the folder in her drawer, right on top of the others. It didn't need labels or subfolders, no sections or color codes. Its value came from what it didn't contain: no clutter, no obligations, no noise. Just presence. And in that stillness, she realized that the act of simplifying her home had been leading her to this very moment, not an end, but a beginning of quiet clarity. The Peace of Mind folder became her quiet promise to herself, to honor calm, to protect stillness, to remember that not every space must be filled to have meaning. As the days passed, she found herself sitting longer in the mornings, breathing slower, smiling at nothing in particular. Her home, once overflowing with reminders of the past, now breathed like a living thing, open, uncluttered, peaceful. Noriko no longer feared silence. It was no longer an echo of what was missing, it was proof of what she had found: balance, acceptance, and serenity. Peace, she discovered, isn't in what we hold on to or even what we let go of. It's in what we allow to remain open, the spaces where light can enter, softly, without asking permission. Noriko's journey came full circle on a quiet Sunday morning. Her 7 folders sat neatly on her desk, a small, unassuming stack, yet each one carried a story, a lesson, a breath of transformation. She didn't feel the thrill of finishing something. Instead, she felt a calm she hadn't known in decades. Her drawers were lighter, yes, but more importantly, her heart was no longer burdened by the quiet weight of unfinished emotions. The act of organizing her papers had become something far deeper, an act of reclaiming peace. Each folder represented a chapter of herself she had reclaimed. The one labeled Today's Papers reminded her to live presently, to stop treating every moment as preparation for something else. Family roots whispered that legacy isn't about keeping everything, but about keeping what matters. Letting go held gratitude instead of grief. Health and hope turned once intimidating medical forms into a map of empowerment. Legacy and letters gave her voice permanence beyond her years. Dreams yet to begin reminded her that possibility still existed at 68. And peace of mind taught her that emptiness, when embraced, becomes sanctuary. As Noriko looked at those folders, she realized something profound. She hadn't just organized her documents. She had organized her life story, each page, a reflection of her resilience. She smiled softly, running her fingers over the edges. It wasn't about tidiness anymore, it was about tenderness. About honoring what had served her and gracefully releasing what no longer did. She took a deep breath and reflected on a lesson that had guided her since she first read about the Japanese schoolchildren who thanked their papers at the end of the year. Those children learned something most adults forget, that gratitude can turn endings into beginnings. Noriko whispered, almost to herself, what Japanese children learn early, we can rediscover later, that peace begins with release. And that, she realized, was the essence of aging gracefully, not accumulating more, but finding freedom in enough. Not chasing the noise of youth, but embracing the melody of stillness. Then she turned toward her audience, her unseen companions in this shared journey of rediscovery. Now, she said warmly, it's your turn. She invited them to begin their own 7-folder ritual, not as a task, but as a gift. To give themselves permission to pause, to reflect, to choose peace over chaos. Start simple, she urged. Gather your papers, your thoughts, your years, and begin with 1 folder. You don't need to finish it today. Just start. Because peace doesn't rush. She reminded them that this isn't about minimalism or perfection, it's about meaning. Your papers tell your story, she said with a soft smile, but your peace writes the ending. Then came the moment of connection, the heartbeat of community she wanted every senior to feel. She leaned in, her voice warm and steady, carrying the strength of shared experience. If this journey touched you, don't keep it to yourself, she said. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone you care about. A friend, a neighbor, someone who might be quietly holding onto their own pile of memories. Let's make this our movement, a circle of calm, compassion, and courage for everyone over 60 finding new peace in old papers. We're not decluttering our lives, we're reawakening them. Noriko closed her final folder, took a sip of tea, and smiled at the stillness around her. It no longer felt empty, it felt alive. And somewhere in that silence, between the rustle of paper and the hum of her heart, was the sound of something sacred, peace finding its way home.